Good morning, all. It's 11:03. Apologies for the couple of minutes delay. We're just waiting for the last few people to join us, and I think we'll get the ball rolling. First and foremost, good morning to everybody, and a very, very warm welcome to all of you to what is the Centre for Army Leadership's final webinar prior to the summer leave period. My name is Major Ben Acton, and I am the SO2 Leadership here at the Centre for Army Leadership. We're honoured today to be joined by Dr. John Blakey, who is the founder and CEO of the Trusted Executive Foundation. He would talk to us about the 9 leadership habits that inspire results, relationships, and reputation, and they're all centred around the central tenet of trust. However, before I briefly frame the talk today, as you've become accustomed to, and introduce John properly, I'd just like to cover a couple of small pieces of housekeeping, if I may, just to make sure this morning runs smoothly. John's talk today will be broken down into 3 parts, each lasting approximately 20 minutes. At the end of each section, we will have a short question and answer session to break it up. This will comprise of approximately 2 to 3 questions, depending on how long it takes, that I will chair. Could I please ask all the audience to submit your questions to John within the text pane on the Zoom app during each of the sessions, and the most popular question will be posed to John. To that end, could I also ask you that if you see a question that you like the look of and you'd like me to ask John, please like that in order to enable it. One other point, in between the second and final session, John will ask you to take part in a poll that will allow you to think and reflect about the 9 leadership habits that we're going to talk about today. In terms of the talk itself, I'd just like to take a moment to talk about why we at the Centre for Army Leadership think trust is so important and at the forefront of our thinking. The Army Leadership Doctrine describes trust as the essence of leadership. We as serving soldiers sign a contract of unlimited liability, and therefore we may be asked to do things and make decisions that could ultimately cost people their lives. Therefore, to be an effective, high-performing team as we aspire to be, we must have trust in our teammates, in our subordinates, in our superiors, and most of all, we must have trust in the institution itself. As the majority of you listening will know, the Army Leadership Doctrine describes in great detail the Army Leadership Framework, the Army Leadership Model, and the Army Leadership Code. And they form the blueprint which we as leaders within the Army work off. The overarching philosophy that underpins these 3 elements is Mission Command, which is the British Army's command philosophy. It is a philosophy that promotes decentralised command, empowerment, and freedom of action at all levels. Whether you're a fire team commander or a brigadier commanding a brigade, the philosophy is the same. Mission Command is fundamentally based on the mutual trust between leaders and who they lead. So as you can see, whether we're on operations, on exercise, or simply in camp, trust is at the very epicenter of what we as Army leaders do. As I'm here at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, it would be remiss of me not to quote Academy Sergeant Major Lord, who we all know is a bit of an institution here. Lord said on trust, I agree with Emerson when he said, trust men and they will be true to you. Treat them greatly and they will show themselves great. Now, I do appreciate that RSM Lord is merely agreeing with Ralph Emerson's famous quote, but I think it succinctly sums up the importance of trust and shows why, even today, it is the very centre of the Army Leadership Doctrine. Really fortunate for us, we have a subject matter expert on the subject with us today in the form of Dr. John Blakey. And it's my absolute pleasure to formally introduce him. John is the founder and CEO of the Trusted Executive Foundation, a not-for-profit organisation that helps board-level teams build high-performance cultures, which is underpinned by the values of trust and challenge. The Trust Executive Foundation delivers Journey of Trust leadership development programs based on the tools and models in John's 2 acclaimed books, The Trusted Executive and Challenging Coaching. His book, The Trusted Executive, which we here at the COW would highly recommend, was shortlisted as the Chartered Management Institute Book of the Year in 2016 and led to John being named as a top 100 global thought leader in trust by Trust Across America, which is no mean feat for those of you who know. The book also features John prize-winning research to create the 9 habits of trust, which we're going to hear about today, as well as outlaying anecdotes and learning from his early career as a FTSE 100 international managing director and highly successful entrepreneur. As you can see, John is very much one of life's overachievers, and we are very, very fortunate to have him here with us today. John, a huge welcome on behalf of the Centre for Army Leadership. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here with us today, and the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Ben, for that introduction. I am one of life's overachievers, but nevertheless, for me to be invited to speak for the Centre of Army Leadership is a privilege today. And it's all down to the power of your brand and the trust in the Army brand and the trust in the Sandhurst brand. You know, that when I consider myself to be addressing that brand and that faculty, it does make me sit up tall and to make sure that I'm at the top of my game for the next hour and a half as I engage you. So I congratulate you on building a brand of trust that has that power, and I'm delighted to be with you today. Welcome everybody else on the webinar. I understand that 70% of you will be in the military, so I'm conscious of tuning the content for the next hour and a half to suit your needs, but I'm also aware that 30% of our attendees are from a non-military background and could be representing private sector, public sector organizations. So one of my challenges for the next hour and a half is for us to focus on leadership as a generic challenge in whatever domain we are working in, and trust being the one thing that can change everything in that domain of leadership. So I'm going to share my screen now and just invite you to join me on this journey of trust this morning. As Ben said, I'm very conscious that one of the tenets of Mission Command is to build cohesive teams through mutual trust. So that is the bond, I think, that again, whatever our background, whatever our domain of leadership, if we're believers in trust, then we're looking to empower teams. We set the intention at a senior level, but we create the freedom through trust for the execution of those objectives to be delivered on the ground by our teams. And my own military career, I have to say, was very short. My father took me to Welbeck College at the age of 14. I think he had a vision of me pursuing a military career. But at the assessment, unfortunately, I'm deaf in my right ear, and that brought that particular branch of achievement for me to a very premature close. So that was my very brief introduction to the military. But I have to say that this work that I've done on trust has brought me much closer to the military, because I've learned that a lot of the habits and leadership principles that I'm going to talk about this morning are very close to the heart and very much part of the fabric of military life. And my 2 colleagues who are members of the leadership team at the Trusted Executive Foundation, one is an ex-naval officer and the other is an ex-army officer from the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers. So I do seem to have been attracted more into this military world as part of this work. And I think that reflects the motto here for the Sandhurst College: serve to lead, servant leadership. You know, Ben talked at the beginning about, you sign a contract to make the ultimate sacrifice if necessary. It's those environments of self-sacrifice that I think most foster this quality of trust. So it's that servant leadership and that mutual trust mindset that we're taking into the session today. In terms of our agenda for the next hour and a half, as Ben says, I'm keen to mix it up a bit. One of the challenges of these virtual webinar environments is that I don't want to get bored of the sound of my own voice. I want to hear your voice as much as I can. I want to hear your questions. I want to get into a dialogue as much as we can. So I'm going to create space for those questions. And I just want to encourage you to ping those questions in anything that comes into your mind, make the most of this time to get the most out of it for you, and just throw those questions in so that we can have as interactive a session as possible. So I'm going to give 3 bursts of content. I'm going to have 3 sprints where I'm going to share with you some content from my research and from my work. And at the end of those sprints, we're going to open it up and take 2 or 3 questions, have a little bit of a change of gear. I know that for you, some of you will be doing emails, some of you might be feeding the dog, some of you might be thinking about your evening. I want to make sure that we try and keep this as engaging and as committed as possible for the time that we've got. In terms of the agenda, first sprint is going to be just a quick look at, why would we talk about trust now, particularly in the middle of this pandemic and this crisis? Why trust? Why now? After our first round of questions, I'm going to contrast 2 currencies of leadership. I think we have a binary choice in our leadership, whatever our domain. The currency of our leadership can be trust, or the currency of our leadership can be power. And I agree with Charles Green, the author on trust, who said what the world needs right now are leaders who believe in the power of trust rather than leaders who trust in power. So I'm hoping that part of the reason you're all here on this webinar this morning is because you're believers in the power of trust, and you believe that the future of leadership is about trust rather than power. But we have to realize we've been brought up in a world where the currency of leadership was often power. And therefore, there are habits of power-based leadership which we need to unlearn. And there are habits of trust-based leadership that we need to learn afresh. And our final sprint today will be to look at what those habits are. My research at Aston Business School was to get at the behavioral habits of trust. Trust is a big, vague, emotive word. It means different things to different people. But what I can share with you in this webinar is a roadmap for trust, a map and a compass that allows you to make trust a very practical thing in your leadership. So we're going to go from this big picture word of trust down to that very practical day-to-day. How do you show up as a leader? And the poll that we'll do towards the end of the webinar is really to give you a focus. You can't focus on 9 habits at the same time. So which is the one habit that could make the most difference for you in your leadership right now, particularly in the context of this current pandemic? Because I think now is a time when all of us need to be at the top of our game in terms of leadership. So that we're going to leave the session today on a point of focus and commitment, because my aim for this session is I'd love it to be thought-provoking. I'd love you to have new thoughts as part of this webinar. But what would be even better for me is it's action-provoking. So I'd love it to be both thought-provoking and action-provoking. I'd love it that tomorrow when you wake up and you think about your day and you think about your leadership, that you actually take one habit from today and one action for that, and you start to work the muscle of these habits of trust. Because if you do that over a period of time, you will build a brand of trust. And maybe one day you'll build a brand as powerful as Sandhurst in terms of the trust that it compels in all the people that come into contact with it. So that's our aim, is to build that brand of trust, whether it's as individuals or as organizations. So let's kick off with why trust, why now? Stephen Covey is one of my inspirations for this work. He had his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And in that book, Stephen Covey talked about trust. And he said, trust is the glue of life. It's the most essential ingredient in effective communication. It's the foundational principle that holds all relationships. So if trust is the glue of life in normal times, can you imagine how much we need the super glue of trust in the middle of a crisis, in the middle of a pandemic, when all the rules have been suspended and we're all trying to reinvent and innovate into a very different world that is emerging post-lockdown. So that super glue of trust is something that I think we're going to need more than ever in these current very uncertain and volatile times. Stephen Covey is a leadership guru. It's a soundbite. For us to become believers in something, some of us need more than just a great quote. You know, show me the numbers, show me the evidence that tells me that trust is a great thing. So I just want to share with you a couple of studies that for me are particularly important in underlining the power of trust. So the first study is by a guy called Dr. Paul Zak. He had an article in Harvard Business Review 18 months ago called The Neuroscience of Trust. And his research was to compare the impact of high trust cultures versus low trust cultures, particularly the impact on staff. And what he found was that in high trust cultures, there's 74% less stress, 13% less sick days, 50% more productivity, 76% more engagement. So whether you're in the military, whether you're in the public sector, whether you're in the private sector, for me, these are very compelling statistics. If I could give you a magic wand and you could wave it in your work environment tomorrow morning and you'd get this outcome, I think I'd have a cue for that magic wand. And trust is that magic wand. It is the one thing that changes everything. In 2016, I wrote this book, The Trusted Executive. Nobody's yet written a book called Trust is Dead. Trust does not work. Trust is yesterday's news. Nobody's written that book because, quite frankly, there isn't a leadership guru or an academic researcher who could give you the substance to support that argument. Trust is that magic wand. And I think it's figures and statistics like this that should really convince us that this is a quality of leadership that can have such a multiple impact across different stakeholder groups. And when we come a bit closer to home and we think about teams and high trust teams, what makes a perfect team? That was a question that Google wanted to ask in its organization. It wanted to get to that secret source of the high trust perfect team. And it launched a project called Project Aristotle. Took 2 years to conduct that project. 180 teams were involved, 37,000 employees. And the answer that they found to that question, what makes a perfect team, surprised them, because it wasn't the individual charisma of the team leader. It wasn't the technical brilliance of the team members, but it was actually this phrase, psychological safety. Psychological safety. So teams in which we feel psychologically safe are teams in which we will perform the best. And of course, psychological safety is one side of the coin of trust. High trust environments are psychologically safe. Psychologically safe environments are high trust environments. And again, in the middle of a pandemic, we've all been urged to stay safe. And staying safe, we think of it primarily in a pandemic as physical safety. But staying safe psychologically is just as important to staying safe physically over the long run. So one of our challenges as leaders is, are you creating a psychologically safe environment in which your people can perform at their best? Because if you are, you will create that perfect team. And that's another of the impacts that these high trust cultures can generate. So I could show you many, many more slides and statistics about the power of trust. But I hope that you are all believers by being on this webinar, and I hope that those statistics just reinforce and amplify the belief that you've already got. And this slide should really make us sit up and think, because if trust is that important, why is it that the various studies and surveys over the last 20 years have revealed that our institutions in modern life are losing trust? This is a survey called the Edelman Global Trust Barometer. It's carried out every year since the year 2000. I'm showing you here on this slide the 2019 results. 33,000 people surveyed across 28 countries. This is the UK data sample. And at this point in the survey, the question that the respondents have been asked is, do you trust the leaders in the following institutions to do what is right? And you can see that whether it's non-governmental organizations, business, government, or media, less than half of the respondents trusted the leaders in those institutions to do what is right. And these figures are not isolated. We've seen a steady erosion in trust in institutional life over the last 20 years. But that 50% threshold is key when it comes to trust, because when trust falls below 50%, what it means is that when I introduce myself as the officer, as the boss, and I meet you for the first time and introduce myself in that way, these figures suggest that on balance, when I am the person in authority, on average, the person that I'm leading doesn't trust me because I am in the person in authority. If we go back 25, 30 years and I introduce myself as the boss, the officer, then I'm entitled to respect and I command that respect. And most of the people who I introduce myself to respect that authority. But what these figures reveal is that authority is becoming a liability in terms of trust. And that's something that we need to think about as people in authority. We need to think about how can we convert that liability of authority into a high trust relationship, because it used to come with the stripes. It used to come with the badge and the job title. I'm afraid that trust doesn't come with the stripes or the job title anymore. We have to earn it from the ground up. And that's an important shift that's happened in the leadership landscape in the last 20 years. Maybe in our questions and answers, we can have a discussion about why has that happened? Do you see that in your world? What are the trends that are causing this shift of trust to happen in the modern environment? And of course, the media knows that trust is an issue. So the media gets hold of any scandal that it can to sort of reinforce and amplify this narrative that's in people's mind, is that you can't trust them. They don't care about us. I picked up the metro on the way into London last year, and I see this headline, Carillions, Gazillions. And the sub-bullets, hedge fund makes a mint as company fails. Bosses hang on to bulletproof bonuses, but jobs at risk for thousands of workers. I told you, you can't trust them. Later in the year, I pick up another paper and I see more headlines, this time about Thomas Cook. Thomas Cook fat cast must pay back bonuses. Now, these are examples taken from the business world. As I say on this webinar this morning, we've got people and leaders from all different sectors and environments, and obviously a strong military presence. And I'm very grateful that at the moment, if we look at the trust in institutions, the trust in the army is still a very high level. And we haven't had similar headlines around, our military brand. But I think it's something we need to protect and cherish very, very carefully, because the media is so sensitive, and the media is looking to bring down any brand that it can. And if it gets a sniff of anything that will feed this paranoia about trust in leadership, then it will get hold of that. And with social media, it will spread that, fan the flames of that. So all of us who are leaders need to be very, very protective of our brands, and need to be very careful that we don't find ourselves in the crosshairs of this type of scrutiny. So Ben, with that, I'm conscious that we've been going 20 minutes. Just want to sort of change the gear and invite some questions from our participants on everything that I've shared so far, really around the importance of trust, and particularly this loss of trust that's happened in institutional life. I just invite any questions around or observations around that for us to just make sure we've got this big picture feel before we go into the practicalities of trust.
John, first of all, thank you for that initial download. We currently have one question in from Leon. Thank you very much. Before I ask that, if there are any more questions that people have, they'd be warmly welcomed. Leon has asked, do you have to respect someone before you can trust them? Do they both work hand in hand or not?
Do you have to respect someone before you trust them? Well, trust is a dance. And there are two people involved in that dance, the leader and the follower. And I think in that dance, the leader is required to make the first step. So that the leader's responsibility is to go first with the dance of trust, and to extend that invitation to have a trusting relationship. Now, the follower then has to respond to that, and the follower's response to that will be based on a number of assessments of the trustworthiness of the leader. When we look at the habits later, we'll see the sorts of things that go through people's minds when they start to think, do I trust him or her? And I think respect is a collective impression that you get of somebody based on certain behaviors. So what we're going to do later in the session is we'll break down, what is it that generates that feeling of respect when you're working with a leader. So we'll probably come back a bit more to that question and dig into it a bit later. I mean, obviously in that dance of trust, what you find is that some people are quicker to trust than others. So depending upon our history and what relationships we've had, particularly with people in authority in our lives, some of us might have had a positive experience of trust in people in authority. Some of us might have had a negative experience of that. And we will bring that into every relationship that we have in the future. And so part of, what we find as leaders is that it's not one size fits all. You'll find some people will instinctively trust you because you are the boss, but others will be very skeptical and very cynical. And then you have to work much harder with those people to gain the respect that will trigger that trust. Thanks for the question.
Thank you for that response, John. I'll move on to another one that's sort of anchored in the corporate sector and the financial crisis that you alluded to. And it's good to recognise the difference in our worlds. And Rehan asks, what's the level of recognition of the importance of trust in the corporate sector? Bear in mind how important it does to us as low-level teams and as an organisation working to the Crown.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, I think the global financial crisis 2008, 2009 was really the spark for my work with trust, because I think all of us felt at that time, particularly in the business world, that something had shifted very deep in the foundations of trust, and that we'd all been let down badly. And I think we wanted to see a response to that in our leaders. And I think my own experience over the last 10 years of being an executive coach and working with leaders and their teams, I think we're finding an increasing awareness of the importance of trust. I think there's an increasing appetite to understand it and to understand how it works and how it's built and how it's destroyed. So I do think there's an intellectual interest in trust. What I'm hoping that we will see more of in the coming years is moving from wanting to think about it to wanting to actually put it into practice. I think it's one thing to talk the talk, but there's a point where we need to walk the walk. And I think in the modern age, people see through any veneer of trust. People are educated, they have access to social media, we're living in a much more transparent world than we've ever lived in. And because of that transparency, there isn't anywhere to hide from a leadership perspective. We have to be 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We have to have that congruence and that authenticity around trust, because if we make a slip and then that is broadcast, as say through technology and social media, then our reputation very quickly gets undermined. So I think that there's an increasing appetite for this, but I think there's a long way to go to really put it into practice and be consistent with it, in particularly in my experience of the business world.
Fantastic, thank you. One last question, I think, John,
Yep.
before we move on to the second segment, and it's from Stu Jones. How can strategic leadership gain trust in a post-truth world? And what Stu sort of alluding to here in terms of the social media, the power of social media, information age, echo chambers, the Donald Trump effect.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. Yeah, so the post-truth world, fake news, we have created an environment where the truth is whatever you want it to be. And, that has undermined this traditional respect for authority. Because if you think in the past, the voice of authority monopolized truth. The voice of authority, when it spoke, it decided what truth was, and we all believed it. Now, unfortunately, because we've all had our eyes opened and we've seen that sometimes the voice of authority has not always spoken the truth, we've all lost faith in that authority. And I think those figures that you saw in that slide earlier demonstrate that. We've all lost faith. And I think what that means is that we have to realize that we have to rebuild that faith. We have to rebuild that trust. We can't just rely upon it as a legacy from the past, that every one of us as leaders needs to earn that trust every day in the leadership role that we have. And that the moment we get complacent about that, the moment we think we're entitled to trust because we're the one in authority, I think that's the trap that we all need to avoid. There is no easy path around trust these days. And we can complain about that, and we can say, oh, it's not fair, you know, it wasn't my fault that all these things happened. But this is a reality of leadership, and it's much better to engage that reality and stare it in the eye, rather than try to hope that the trust of the past will suddenly miraculously return. It won't unless we earn it. And that's why we need to really focus on these behaviors to know exactly what it is that is going to earn that trust. So thank you for those questions. I hope that sort of just gives you a bit of variety in our format for today. I'm going to now do the second sprint of the session. Let me share my screen, and hopefully you can see the agenda. So I hope that, as I say, most of you were believers in trust before you came today. That's why you're here. But I hope that I've just reinforced that belief and that commitment to the importance and the power of trust as the one thing that changes everything. What I want to move on to now is exploring a little bit more the mindset of leadership, and particularly the mindset of power versus the mindset of trust. Most of us have been brought up in a world of power. Most of us have been tutored by people in authority where the currency of leadership was power. And I'm not saying that's wrong or it's evil or it's bad. I'm just saying that that's how the world was built. And that's the world that most of us have sort of learned our leadership lessons in. And I'm going to contrast that really with a different world, the world of trust, the world where trust is the currency of leadership, not power. And I'm really going to challenge you to think about that quote that I shared earlier, which is, if you think about the world right now, what do we need more of? Do we need more of power, or do we need more of trust? Do we need leaders that trust in power, or do we need leaders that rely on the power of trust? I mean, I know my answer to that question. I think the world is yearning for trust. But, you know, I want to just explore that with you in this next stage of the session. And to do that, I'm going to sort of go back in time a little bit and share a little bit of a personal story. I said that, you know, my military career was very, very short. So I had pursued a different career. I went into the world of business, and in the age of 21, I stepped into a big organization, British Gas, as a rookie, as a new graduate trainee, very ambitious person. And I'm trying to work out, you know, what's the rules of the game around here? How do I get on? You know, and I very quickly worked out, you know, that I'd walked into a temple that worshipped what I call the single bottom line. Now, the single bottom line in business is profit, but in whatever environment you're in, the single bottom line is that short-term result. You know, it's that short-term win. And I walked into a world that was really worshipping the short-term win. And in my world, that was called profit. And I noticed that the sacred pillars that held up that world were these two sacred pillars: intellectual ability and authority. So I had a degree in chemistry. They put me in the marketing department at British Gas. It didn't matter, because all they wanted to know was, does he have a brain? You know, does he have a brain? Because this was a world where me with a bigger brain was valued in terms of the currency of power. And equally, once they tick that box and they know I've got a bigger brain, they then gave me a job title. My first job title was customer service officer. So I did get to be an officer, it turned out, after all. And then I've got the job title, haven't I? I've got the job title then. So here's me with my bigger brain and my job title. So now I can tell people what to do in service of the single bottom line, the short-term win. And that's the world of power. And that's the world that I learned. I didn't know any different. I didn't have any access to any alternative. So my job became to master this world and master the game of power. And that's something that I put my mind to, and I put my efforts to, and I was reasonably successful at doing that. And a lot of my colleagues and peers were doing exactly the same. So this is that industrial age. I call it the industrial model. The industrial model, this is how it was built. This is what it worshipped. And these were its sacred pillars. But I think we're now moving from the industrial age of power-based leadership into the social age of trust-based leadership. So I do think that we're in the middle of like a paradigm shift around leadership. I think this pandemic is accelerating that shift. And I think I want to just share with you my own sort of vision of what the new temple of leadership looks like. What are we worshiping now, and what are the sacred pillars? Because if it's not power, and we all knew that world and we knew it well, how are we going to learn about this new world of trust? Well, the first thing is we need a new God in the temple, because the short-term win is no longer for a lot of people a sufficiently worthy purpose to commit their leadership talent for. In business, you know, we are shifting from the short-term win of profit to what we call now the triple bottom line of profit, people, and planet. But I think whatever domain of leadership you're in, the prize is now a more subtle and complex prize than it used to be. I talk in my book, and the title of this webinar, I talk about results, relationships, and reputation. So the old world is just about results, results, results. And if you happen to screw up a few relationships along the way, and if you happen to destroy your reputation, there was a certain sort of acceptance of that in that world. But I think in this new triple bottom line world, the triple bottom line is that you as a leader expect to deliver results, yes, but also take care of your relationships, which is the people piece, and also take care of your reputation, because you want the Sandhurst reputation. I want the Sandhurst reputation. And that's a legacy that is built over a long period of time. So I'm challenging you today to think about shifting from that single bottom line vision of leadership to the triple bottom line leadership, and make that the purpose of your leadership. Armed with that triple bottom line purpose, we need some new sacred pillars. So if power isn't a sufficiently sticky glue to hold us all together anymore in this post-truth world, then what is the glue that is going to do that? Stephen Covey talked about trust as the glue of life. And so trust is the only thing that we know that is sufficiently sticky to hold this modern world together. If it isn't going to be authority that does that, we need trust to do that. So that is why I think in a modern environment, trust is becoming increasingly critical to our leadership skill set. And that then begs the question is, what are the sacred pillars of trust? You know, it's a big word, it's a vague word, but tell me how to make it practical. And the first step in that process of making trust practical is to think about the three sacred pillars of trust. And this has been in the research on trust for 20, 30 years. So there's nothing new about these pillars, but for a lot of us in leadership life, we haven't necessarily been familiar with this model. But I can share with you that the three pillars of a trust-based temple of leadership are ability, integrity, and benevolence. So for me to earn your respect, for me to be trusted, I need to demonstrate all three pillars. I need to be competent at the job I'm here to do. I then need to have that integrity, that ethics, that honesty, those values that I demonstrate consistently in order to tick the pillar of integrity. And then thirdly, I need this interesting word, benevolence. Now, when I first came across this formula for trust in the research, I had to go and look up what this word benevolence meant, because I'd never been on the Introduction to Benevolence course for senior leaders. It's not a word that I'd come across in 30 years of leadership development. I'd never seen it in any leadership competency framework. So it's a little bit of a novelty for me to see this word. And I look up what it means in a dictionary, and benevolence is the opposite of malevolence. Benevolence means wishing well for others. It's common human care, compassion, kindness. And I think the world of power did not need benevolence. If you brought benevolence in the world of power, it was like a nice to have. It was like an extra that you bought because you were a human being. But actually, strictly speaking, the world of power doesn't need benevolence. But the world of trust does need benevolence. And therefore, for most of us who've been brought up in the world of power, this model means that it's time to insource benevolence. You know, I hope that's an exciting prospect for us all. I mean, particularly in this pandemic I think we've seen a bit of that insourcing of benevolence. We've seen outbreaks of compassion. We've seen a contagion of kindness. And I'm just hoping that as we come out of this pandemic, having rediscovered some of those qualities, I'm hoping that as leaders, we're going to insource this benevolence and really make it an important part of the mix of our cultures and our leadership life. Because the maths of this formula for trust are quite brutal. That trustworthiness is ability times integrity times benevolence. It's not ability add integrity, add benevolence. So what that means in terms of the maths is that if you score 0 on any one pillar, you won't be trusted. You won't earn that respect. The people that earn the respect and earn the trust, they tick all 3 boxes. They're competent at what they do. They're honest. They have those values, and they care. They care about the people in their command. They care about the people who are in their leadership. So that benevolence piece is, I think, for most of us, the one to really think about carefully. Are we really servicing all 3 pillars? Because if we do service all 3 pillars and we get into that upper quartile of competence on all 3 pillars, then big numbers multiplied by big numbers to create that trustworthy leader, that trustworthy brand. And that's how we start to differentiate our leadership around this currency of trust. So to close out this section, before I take a few questions on this particular topic of power and trust, I'm hoping that on the webinar today, we've got some fans of the film The Matrix, because I'm going to play you a short clip from The Matrix, which I think captures the essence of the choice that we are faced with every day in our leadership. Those of you that have seen the film The Matrix will instantly recognize this metaphor that I'm going to use about the blue pill and the red pill. But those who haven't seen the film, I just want to share with you a little bit of the background before I show you this short clip, which I think captures the essence, as I say, of this paradigm shift around power and trust in leadership. So in the film, the hero of the film is a guy called Neo. And Neo has been living in what he thought was the real world, but it turns out it was a computer-generated simulation. So many of us think we've been living in the real world of power. And we've come to believe that it's the only world that exists. But what I'm encouraging you to open your minds to is the idea that that's just one way of looking at things. And there are many different ways of looking at things. And maybe we're at a point where people are starting to look at things very differently. So Neo in this world, this computer simulated reality, he meets a leadership guru, a guy called Morpheus. In the clip that I show you, Morpheus is the guy with the mirrored spectacles and the long leather trench coat. And as leadership gurus do, Morpheus starts to open Neo's eyes to the nature of the reality that he's part of. And he starts to educate Neo as to some different ways of looking at things. But in the midst of that, he also then presents Neo with a choice. He says, you can either stay in the matrix, stay in that old paradigm, stay in that old world, keep following those rules, or you can wake up and enter a different paradigm and play by different rules. But he warns him that waking up is an uncomfortable thing to do. It takes us out of our comfort zone. It means we have to learn new things if we're going to master a new reality. And that's therefore, it's not an easy choice to make. But I think if I share the video clip with you, and let's just reflect upon the words that we hear Morpheus use with Neo and reflect on them in terms of our leadership and the choice between power and trust. So I'm just going to share my screen again and find the video clip. Here we go.
Do you want to know what it is? The matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work. when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth.
What truth?
That you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind. Unfortunately, no one can be told what the Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more. To know.
Oh, I hope you enjoyed that. I love The Matrix. I'm shame we can't watch a little bit more of it this morning, but I wanted to just share that with you because I think the metaphor, the red pill and the blue pill, is a powerful metaphor for us in leadership. When I'm delivering this session face to face, what I do at this point, I have a couple of jelly beans. I have a red jelly bean with me and a blue jelly bean. I put them in my hands and I stand up in front of the group and I just say, look, I'm offering you a choice. You know, I'm offering you the blue pill, the world of power. If you want to keep worshiping in that world, then fine, it's your choice. Or I'm offering you the red pill of trust. But what I can say to you is that there is no purple pill. You can't be half pregnant. We do need to make a choice. And every day that you come into your leadership in whatever world that you're leading, you are making that choice. You are trusting in power, or you're relying on the power of trust. And I want to really encourage you to commit to a choice. Some of you may say, this is all very well, I'm going to take the blue one, thank you very much. That's fine. I just want us to be wholehearted about whatever choice we make. And clearly the choice I've made is that I stand for trust, and I take the red pill every morning with my cornflakes. So with that sort of, I just want to open it up for another 2 or 3 questions, Ben, at that point, before we look then at those of you who want to take the red pill. The next question is, okay, I'm committed. Show me how to do it. And that's when we look at these 9 habits. But you need to make that choice first before we get into the next stage of the game.
Perfect. Thank you, John. John, I think there's a few people just saying that the audio has gone slightly quiet at your end. So I don't know if there's anything at your end you could adjust that.
Yes.
Greatly
sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've turned my audio down in order not to create an echo on the video, but I forgot to turn it back up. So I'm
Fantastic.
back up now.
Thank you very much. Again, some really useful insights, and we've had a fair few questions coming as a response. Paul Lestrange, I believe from the Royal Irish, has a question focused on toxic leadership, and it's particularly popular, and I think probably because we've all unfortunately had the experience of working for under toxic leadership, and we can see what a corrosive effect it can have, particularly on trust. So Paul's question is, one of the most challenging issues in the military is dealing with toxic leadership, which obviously undermines trust. How would you suggest we can build and maintain trust and still be able to highlight any negative toxic behaviors within a hierarchical organization, especially from above?
Yeah, well, there's the nub of it, isn't it? And I mean, I think that question and asking that question has demonstrated one of the keys, to the answer there. One of the habits that we're going to talk about in these 9 habits is being brave. And I'm not talking here about physical bravery. I'm talking about moral bravery. So one of the things that inspires trust is moral bravery. And the person who asked that question, I think it's a brave question to ask. It's probably one of those questions that a lot of people on the call are maybe thinking about, but think, I'm not sure I'll ask that question. But I think asking that question is the start of the process by which we disempower toxic leadership, is by being brave. You know, there is a point where speaking up, challenging the status quo, obviously you do it as skillfully and as respectfully as you can, but there are some conversations that we need to have in organizational and institutional life. And as we come out of this pandemic and this lockdown, I think the hunger for having those conversations is going to be even more in the people that we lead. And the measure of us as leaders is when we get challenged, because maybe we all do things at times that could be seen as toxic. When we get challenged by the people who we lead, who actually point something out and say, hang on a minute, is this really what we're about? Is this really what we stand for? The big challenge for us is then how we handle that, how we respond to that. Do we get into the conversation or do we close it down? And I think, the leaders who stand for trust will get into the conversation. It'll feel uncomfortable, that they might at times feel like, that they're not being given the due respect, but that's how we earn respect, is by to get in that conversation and have that difficult conversation. So I think the answer to your question is keep doing what you just did, which is be brave to ask the question, to point things out, and to not shirk the little things that over time sow the seeds for toxic cultures. Stamp on the little things and stamp on them quick, because if they start to get hold, that's when it becomes a bigger issue for us all to resolve. Thanks, Ben.
Fantastic. Thanks, John. That's actually some really great food for thought there. We at the CAL have been looking at some areas of this, and actually moral courage, which I think is what you were alluding to at the beginning, is actually one of the Army's core values, which all of us should live by. And it's interesting that seems to be the central tenet in your thoughts. Equally, there's insight that we have. One of our friends of the CAL has written about is intelligent disobedience. There's also a fairly good book, as you probably know, on that, and it all links back to that moral courage and doing the right thing on a difficult day. So thank you. The next question that I will pose, John, is from Richard Harris, and it's to do with training and organisations. So it's an interesting one that we've discussed here before. Is as an army, we spent 99% of our time training and 1% of time, you could figure there, but a large portion of time training and a short portion of time actually doing operations. Whereas in industry and the commercial sector, it's arguably the other way around. Yep. So Richard House's question is, in organisations like the Army, we have long periods of training in order to learn leadership behaviours. Often in industry, there isn't a culture or resource for long training courses, and learning must be done on the job. Have you seen any good examples of how industry has developed leaders in its people without formal training courses?
Yeah, it is a big difference, as you say. Probably the percentage of time that's spent in training. How does industry do that without that commitment of time off the job? I think one of the ways that I think industry is doing that and doing it well, and it's something that's changed in the last sort of 10, 15 years, is really the job that I do is as a coach. There's a lot of coaching going on in industry now, as opposed to training. And one of the powerful things about coaching is it can be delivered in short, bite-sized chunks. So I work with leaders, and it might be a 1.5 hour session, which is tailored to the individual needs of that leader. I also work with peer groups. So I'll bring together 10 or 12 managing directors, entrepreneurs, and we'll spend a day together, and we'll do team coaching, where people are presenting challenges and we're working through those challenges together in real time, and we're bringing particular leadership models and insights to that in a very dynamic way. But we're actually working with real the thing with coaching is we're working with the real challenges today. It's not a theoretical exercise that we might then implement in the future. Coaching is very immediate. We're looking to work with today's challenges and bring insight and learn into those so that we can make an immediate impact. And I think in industry, that's very appealing because it means you're not separating training and doing the job. You're basically bringing it together and saying, we're going to coach on the job to deliver impact now. And I think industry finds that, an efficient and effective way to do that.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, John. In the interest of time, I'll add one more question, if you're content, from John O'Neill. If you've got time, fantastic.
Quick one. Yep.
John's question anchors back to my opening comments about the Armed Leadership Doctrine and Mission Command. And he asks, Armed Leadership Doctrine promotes trust in its use of mission command, delegating authority to the lowest level possible. This is positive as it promotes freedom and speed of action. But as leaders, we also have legal responsibility for the conduct of our personnel under the law of command responsibility. How can a leader effectively balance trust in their personnel against responsibility for when things are going wrong?
Yeah. So we've got this sort of sphere of freedom, aren't we? We're building a sphere of freedom in which we can trust people, and therefore we delegate and empower into that zone of freedom. But I think there are boundaries. There are always in every institutional environment. There are boundaries which we as leaders are in a position of responsibility to govern those boundaries. And I think my experience of working with teams, high trust teams, is that if you have the right team and the right trust, the trust will trust you to play that role and will respect you playing that role. They'll know that you're playing that role because you have to protect the integrity of the system. They don't see you playing that role just because you get a kick out of being the boss or the kick out of being the one that can say yes or say no. In high trust teams, the followers trust the leader because they know that somebody has to protect the integrity of the system. And I think as long as you look at that part of your leadership role as you're there to protect the integrity of the system, and don't look at that as an authoritarian role, look at it as an important part of the trust building role, because to be psychologically safe, people need to know that there are boundaries. They need to know what the implications are of crossing those boundaries, but talk about it in that language rather than it's some sort of parent-child sort of relationship where, you get to be the sort of the invincible sort of power figure in that situation. Thanks, Ben.
John,
so I'm gonna crack on. Yeah. So we're into the final sprint, everybody. I hope that we're keeping you engaged and on message with this trust piece. And I'm going to close out today, as I say, with really getting into the practicalities of it. We've looked at that big picture. We've looked at that paradigm of trust and power. We've taken our red pill, and now we just want to know, tell me how to do it. So that's what I'm going to do in this last part of the session. Is I'm going to give you this model, the 9 habits of trust. I'm assuming we've all taken our red pill, and now we're just ready to get on and practice the habits that we need to show. So the good thing about this model that I'm sharing with you is that because I wanted this to have substance and rigor, I did put myself into the classroom at the grand old age of 47. I put myself into a doctorate program at Aston Business School in 2012 to research trust, because I used to, as a coach, get to a point in my coaching where I'd have leaders say, look, John, I get this. It's great. I want to do it. How do I do trust? And I couldn't actually give them a scientifically verified answer to that question. I could give them my own sort of experience and other people's experience, but there's nothing that's more credible than having a scientifically verified model. So that's what I wanted to get at in the research Aston Business School. And I'm glad to say that 8 years later, I can present this model to you as something that has legs. It's not something I dreamt up over a glass of red wine. So these 9 habits came out of many interviews, many surveys, and all the statistical analysis that goes on in academic life. So we're talking here about 9 habits. And I know that if you practice these habits in your leadership, you will inspire trust. 3 habits of ability, 3 habits of integrity, 3 habits of benevolence. So habits of ability, we need to deliver. Whatever the job is, whatever the domain of leadership, we need to get the job done professionally, on time, to quality, to budget. Then we need to coach the people around us. In the blue pill world, we told them what to do with our bigger brains. In the red pill world of trust, we coach people, we listen to them, we ask them questions, we empower them. Third habit of ability, be consistent. In the blue pill world of power and fear, I worked for leaders who did something different on a Wednesday to what they did on a Tuesday to what they said on a Monday. The theory was it kept you on your toes, and it did, where fear was the glue of life. But nothing destroys trust as quickly as unpredictability of behavior. So the third habit is be consistent. Have that values-based leadership that allows you to behave consistently in the good times and in the bad times, through high stress and through high drama. 3 habits of integrity: be honest, be open, be humble. Be honest, I think, is something that we knew in the blue pill world and the red pill world. It's a very clear value that many institutions have had very deeply in their governance. Be open is a little bit different to being honest. Being open is about showing some vulnerability. It's about showing up as the full self. It's about taking the job title off, taking the stripes off the shoulder, and showing up as the real you. I think in this pandemic, as we've all been on Zoom and we've been at home and little kids have wandered into the screen, dogs have started barking in the background, we've been there in our sort of dressed down clothes, we've started to sort of experience the real people behind that sort of institutional persona. And being open and showing a bit of that authenticity and that vulnerability in the right place at the right time is very key to this habit of integrity in being open. Being humble, this is at the heart of servant leadership. You know, we're here to serve. We're here to serve a bigger purpose. And it's that keeps us humble, because we're in service to the purpose. We're not in service of our own advancement. And then finally, 3 habits of benevolence: evangelize, be brave, be kind. Evangelize is an interesting word. Some of you will hear that as a religious word. But evangelize, what does it mean at its core? It means spread the good news. And in this social media echo chamber of cynicism and negativity that is being spun around us every day, we as leaders need to get on the front foot with the good news about our team, our mission. Pump that good news into the system, because if you don't, you will drown in a sea of negativity and cynicism. And I think sometimes, particularly in our culture, in the UK culture, we can be quite reserved around this evangelism. And I'm really keen to encourage us all to get on the front foot and be more expressive, more inspiring and excited about the vision and the mission, because that inspires trust. Habit number 8, being brave. I talked about this earlier. In the blue pill world, it was the bravery of power, the physical bravery of charging into battle on the white steed, shouting, "Follow me." This is a different sort of bravery. This is moral bravery. The bravery of the red pill world is moral bravery. The slightly quaint idea that at some point the leader will self-sacrifice on behalf of the bigger mission. Now, I think in the army, that's probably a much more well-drilled mindset than I've ever experienced it in business. I've also worked a lot in sport and in sports coaching. I see it a lot in sport as well, that ability to self-sacrifice for the good of the team. But it's a habit, particularly in the world of business, that I think we've got a lot to learn about in this world of trust. And finally, this 9th habit, be kind. What has kindness got to do with leadership? I mean, if I'd have used that word in the boardroom of British Gas all those years ago, I think they would have hounded me out of the building. But it turns out that kindness is one of the 9 habits. It turns out that the science says kindness is one of the 9 habits of trust, and trust is the magic wand that changes everything. So I hope it's good news to you on this call that kindness is part of leadership if you're working with trust as your leadership currency. That random acts of kindness, tiny noticeable things, if you inject those into your leadership, it's like sprinkling a purple dye into the pond. The whole complexion of the situation changes. Incredibly powerful tool, one that I have discovered far too late in my career. I wish I'd been a guru of kindness much earlier than I ever have, and I'm still got a lot to learn around the 9th habit of being kind. But I am convinced that it is a very powerful tool of leadership, and one that we've got a lot more to learn about in terms of its impact alongside all of the other 8 habits. We're not doing any of these habits in exclusion of the others. It's about being mindful of the mix and the balance and the tension between these habits. But a lot of leaders I work with and the teams I work with, they use this as like a compass or as a checklist. You know, when they're about to make big decisions, and at the moment we've got a lot of tough decisions to make in a lot of our leadership, they check in with the 9 habits and they just make sure that they're having a conversation about all 9. You know, are we really making these visible and explicit in our leadership? And hopefully the models can allow you to have better conversations about important things. And that's really how I'd like you to see this model, is just use it as a checklist, use it as a language to maybe discuss difficult and tricky decisions and dilemmas in your leadership. And the reason why I particularly want you to embrace this model and to practice these habits is that the other part of my research was to get at the impact of the importance of leadership behavior when it comes to building high trust cultures. And it won't be any surprise to us in terms of our experience to know that the science says that over 50% of what generates a high trust culture is the behavior of the senior leadership team. So we talked about toxic cultures, you know, the fish rots from the head. We know the negative sort of cycle that can dig in. There is a positive virtuous cycle that can kick in as well. That if you start standing for trust, if you start practicing these 9 habits, what you'll notice is it ripples out into the culture. People start copying you. You start being kind, they start being kind. You start being a bit more open, they start being a bit more open. You coach a bit more and tell a bit less, they coach a bit more and tell a bit less. And that's how over time, role modeling and leading by example are the most powerful leaders for building a high trust culture. So your behavior matters, your leadership matters. That's both a responsibility of leadership, but it's also, I hope, an exciting opportunity that you can make more of a difference than you might think because your behavior matters. So I think at this point, Ben, it would be good to open up for some questions, but also to invite people, if we can bring that poll up again, and to invite people to the ones who haven't completed the poll. What I'm really interested in with this poll is typically when I'm doing this face-to-face, we would go into like a breakout session now and we'd start to discuss these habits, and we can also have various self-assessment questionnaires that allow people to examine and work out which is the stronger habits or which is the weaker habit in an individual or a team. Now, because we're on a webinar, we haven't got the scope to get into all of that discussion. But I think instinctively, I'd just like to ask you to think about this question on the poll. You know, which of these 9 habits do you need to focus on to maximize the impact of your leadership? Now, that might be something that's a strength. You might already be a fantastically sort of great, brave leader, and you just want to be world famous for that. It might be a weaker one that you think, really, that's a blind spot, and if I don't tick that box, it's going to undermine my trust. Or it could just be that right now in this pandemic, you know, there's a particular habit that's important to focus on just because of the circumstances in which you're leading. So I just want to invite you to pick a habit, because we're all busy leaders. None of us can work on 9 habits, but there's a fighting chance that if you take one habit from this session and really focus on it, then that's a habit that you could continue to make progress with after the session. And clearly in my book, there's a chapter on each habit. So in terms of just getting more resource and help around how you might develop that habit, there's lots of resources on the web and, I say, in the book that would help you do that. And maybe in our questions, we can just explore maybe who is picking which habit, or whether you've got a question about any of these habits, or any ideas about how you could put the habit into practice. Because sometimes when you hear other people talk about practical steps, it inspires other people on the webinar to think of new ideas. So let's use the questions and the time we've got now just to have as much sharing as we can in this virtual environment.
John, fantastic. Thank you. We have about 17 minutes before we'll have to draw to a close. So there's some time to ask those pertinent questions from the audience. If I may, the framework is fantastic and it's a really useful insight. So thank you first and foremost. The first two questions are actually anchored in power. There's sort of a power theme going through, and the first one from Sergeant Phil Mitten, who is actually a friend of the CAL, one of our activists, and does an awful lot of work for us. He also manages to throw a link in there to the matrix, so you will be pleased. He said, many ground level leaders have already taken the red pill. They want a world built on trust and see its value. How do they influence their own leaders to commit to a shift from power to trust when our annual reports are written by them? Healthy challenge and moral courage to effect changes carry personal risk. So he's trying to do the balance of sort of constructive insubordination to a certain extent, but still maintaining that integrity of the reporting system. Yeah.
So this is a challenge that, again, whether in the military or the private sector, the public sector, we will all relate to, because we're all working in imperfect institutions. And I think one of the ways to think about that is, one of the ways I've thought about it in my career, sometimes I've been in institutions where there was such a values misalignment between, my own values and the institution's values, that I really had to think hard about whether it was the right place for me to be, because it would probably have triggered in me a rebellion and a reaction that wouldn't have been constructive. And therefore you have to sort of be realistic about, is that a marriage made in heaven or not? There have been other organizations that I've been in where the values alignment has still been, the values misalignment has still been there, but it hasn't been as severe for me to become a rebel in that system. What's happened is that I've felt that there's been scope for me to be a change agent in that system. And I've focused on how can I, over time, influence around here? How can I build sufficient trust with sufficient people, including people in authority, that one day somebody turns around to me and says, what do you think? And then you know that you've got an opportunity at that point to influence the institution. And I think if you can see that often a lot of the role that we play is how to be a great change agent. And a great change agent is on the one hand, an ability to fit in, ability to empathize and to respect, but it's also an ability not to lose your authentic views and an ability to be brave in the right place at the right time, to share those views and speak up and to influence things in a direction that you believe over time will help it that trust be built. In that way, if you think of it as being a change agent, you can stay being part of the solution rather than being part of the problem. I think if you become a rebel, you become part of the problem. And I think if you become someone who loses their voice and loses their individual authenticity, you also become part of the problem. That the trick is to stay part of the solution. And I think that's about becoming a great change agent and really thinking hard about what the great change agents do in order to walk that tightrope of fitting in and yet also still being authentic and influencing things over a period of time. Thanks, Ben.
Fantastic, thanks, John. Just pressing the wrong buttons there. Thank you for that. And leading on to that, and it does actually have sort of it's a sort of great segue into the next question, which is actually one from the team here at the Centre for Army Leadership. Is leadership not always about power? The power to influence. If we change our mindset on the notion of power, seeing it as a positive, it can complement and enhance trust. Leaders use their power to empower, harnessing trust with those they lead, which in turn empowers the leader, giving them more power, and so the positive circle continues. Is that something that sort of resonates with you, or is something you'd sort of like to add on that?
Yeah, I think influence is maybe a more constructive word for us to use. I think when we use words like power, then there's a sort of a moral element of that, isn't there? Whereas influence, how do we exert influence as leaders? You know, great leaders are highly influential. Now, some of them influence things through, as I say, that authority and that institutionalized power, but others influence things through a more personal power, which I think is based on trust. So when I talk about power in this session, and the question is helping me be a bit clearer about this. When I talk about power here, I'm talking about institutionalized power. That you're borrowing the power of the institution and the job title or the role, rather than relying upon your own authentic personal power to influence things. And I think when you rely on your personal power, you have to build trust with the people around you. I think in the short term, you can borrow institutional power to be a leader, but I think it always catches up with you. And in the modern world, I think it's going to catch up with you quicker and quicker. It's the shelf life of institutional power is getting shorter and shorter. So I think for that sustainable influence, we're all going to need to shift from institutional power as the currency to personal power. And personal power, to me, trust is at the heart of being able to exercise personal power.
Fantastic, really, really useful there, John, and some brilliant food for thought. What I will do, if I may, with the last sort of couple of questions, I'll ask one question, and then we'll unveil the sort of results of the poll, and I've got a question from the team here off the back of those results, if that's okay with you.
Okay.
So the next question is sort of very Machiavellian and sort of left field. John Douglas asks, in the West, we assume that our adversaries and our competitors share a similar rules-based order. In prioritizing trust, would the military and industry deny itself from leaders that adopt Machiavellian tendencies, but who win and achieve results? So he also caveats with that is, of course, he doesn't advocate negative leadership traits, and this is all sort of underpinned on sort of the rules-based order and sticking to the rule, so to speak.
Yeah. And I mean, that's at the heart of it, isn't it? The rule-based order. I mean, this is, to me, is the blue pill versus red pill choice. That what do you stand for? You know, do you stand for the rules-based order, or do you stand for something different to that? And I think we are in the midst of a bit of a battle for that high ground. And I think it is a time for everybody to know where they stand and to plant their flag, to use that metaphor very clearly, because what is the alternative to a rules-based order? I mean, it probably is basically a free-for-all. I mean, it's a free-for-all. It's last man standing wins. It's dog eat dog, and it's basically the law of the jungle. Now that is a way. That is a sort of. It's possible that you could set a system up on that basis, and it's been done, and I'm sure it'll be done again. But is it really the modern way to create a sustainable, healthy, balanced system? And particularly, with some of the challenges we've got, the bigger picture challenges we've got now in the world around climate change, around poverty, around terrorism, is that really the way? Now, I'm not saying that it's easy, and I'm not saying that it's guaranteed to be successful. But it's a little bit like the, is it worthwhile to fight for that rules-based order and to stand for that, and even if it ends up meaning that we fail, isn't that an honourable failure? And isn't an honourable failure better than a dishonourable success? And I just think that's a choice everyone has to make, and we all get challenged on it. We all get moments when we maybe don't step up to the ideal. But what sort of world do you want your grandchildren to live in? I mean, that's ultimately the question you're going to sort of be sat with one day.
Yeah, John, fantastic. I couldn't agree with you more. And we as an organisation live by the values and standards and doing the right thing, and therefore everything that we do must be anchored in that. It was just an interesting sort of alternative view and food for thought. If I may, then what we will do now is we'll now share the results of the poll, and off the back of that, as you can see, by sort of 5%, be brave, which is actually the initial poll that we put out, about 50% of people filled out, looked quite differently to this. So from your part 3 talking about the 9 leadership behaviours, it's actually had an influence on what people think on that. So be brave is out front, and the question, the final question that I'll put to you, that actually has synergy with a fair amount that we've discussed today, and then the questions that have been posed to you, is what practical advice do you have to support people to develop their moral courage? Now, as you've spoken about it and the questions have alluded to, this is particularly important to us as the Army, as a hierarchical organisation, where there is speaking truth to power in a respectful way is so important. And therefore, what practical tips do you have for all our junior leaders out there to empower them?
Yeah, great. Well, I mean, that's a really interesting poll, because it actually looks quite different to the sort of polls that I've typically seen in business, where actually the habits of being open and evangelizing are strong, and being kind would often come out weaker. So it's interesting, a different profile. But the being brave, if we focus particularly on that being brave habit, what tips? Well, the thing with being brave, to me, I sometimes think about lack of bravery as like a phobia. It's like if you're scared of spiders, don't jump into a room full of spiders. And if you think about being brave as a phobia, then basically you've got to start small. You've got to start, don't jump into a room full of spiders, but maybe go into a room with one spider in it and get used to that and start to master your confidence at that level. So I think with moral bravery, I often talk to people about where can you start and start small. Start with something where the risks are not massive. You're not talking about, doing something reckless, but practice it. Practice small steps of moral bravery where you're just speaking out a little bit more. You're just finding your voice, you're challenging something, and then you're seeing what the reaction is. And as you get feedback, you start to refine how you challenge, you get better at it, and it's practice. So I think that would be one tip, is start small with being brave, and practice and learn how to be brave skillfully. The second tip around being brave would be find people in your network who are brave and who do this well, and spend time with them and watch them and observe them. Start to find people who you really admire and inspire you from a point of their bravery, their moral bravery, and then spend time with them, talk to them, observe them. It's amazing how much you will rub off on you over a period of time if you find the right role models. Like we said before, that leaders are role models and that example, and you being amongst people who are setting that example. But sometimes you have to find those people. You have to dig them out. They're not always just presented to you. You have to make an effort to go and find those mentors, go and find those people, rather than expecting that it's always going to be necessarily just presented to you, because these leaders are quite rare, but they're worth spending time with. John,
Fantastic. Some really good nuggets in there, so thank you. I will draw that to a close there. On behalf of the Centre for Army Leadership and everyone listening in, we cannot thank you enough for today. It's been insightful. It's been fascinating. It's been absolutely brilliant. So thank you. There's some fascinating insights and some food for thought for everyone to take away. I know I've got a couple that I've not jotted down that I'm going to go and reflect on. And I think we'd all agree that the 9 leadership behaviours are a brilliant framework for creating trust. From a personal perspective, I'm a big fan of being kind. Please excuse the hardware that seems to be going off. From a personal perspective, I think being kind is an exceptionally powerful behaviour, and one I know I've used in command. That I think as an organisation we should really embrace. For the wider audience, this webinar will be available for you on our usual channels, on our YouTube channel. Please feel free to share it with your teams, as I think educating as many people as we can and getting the message across on the power of trust is absolutely fundamental to our success. Equally, on that YouTube channel, you'll find all our previous webinars and physical speaker series, which are obviously a fantastic resource for your individual and teams leadership education as you move forward. In terms of the next steps, please keep an eye on our various social media platforms for the details of the next webinar and event, which we are hoping will be in September. John, again, thank you for taking the time, and thank you to everyone listening out there for taking time out of your schedule to listen in today. Take care.
Thank you, Ben.